Hello, I'm LA Controller Ron Galprin. As our city's Chief Financial Officer and watchdog, it's my job to manage the city's spending and to make sure that public dollars are being put to good use by keeping our government honest, responsive, and accountable. Because people want to know, and deserve to know, that our government is doing its best to serve you and to use your money well. It's important for the city to plan how to use its money wisely and make good investments. And it's just as important for each of us as Angelenos to do the same. Because the financial health of our city government depends on the financial health of every Angeleno. That is why it's so important that we have programs and workshops for financial planning and financial literacy to help you to succeed and to make positive financial choices about your futures, to plan, to save, to invest, to manage your finances for your future, for your family's future, for our city's future. Thank you so much to our wonderful LA Library and its leadership, including Chief Librarian John Szabo. Thank you to all of the staff and to the volunteers, notably our certified financial planners, and the Library Department of Lifelong Learning and its partners. Thank you for ensuring that everyone has the tools and resources necessary to get on a good track and to stay on a good track financially. To help with this, I would encourage you to check out my How to Build a Financial First Aid Kit tool, which gives you all of the info you need to be prepared for an emergency. And you can check that out at lacontroller.org/financial first aid kit. I wish you a positive and fruitful experience at this event, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Mr. Galpin. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Sakarian, and I work for the Office of Civics and Community Services here at the Los Angeles Public Library. Welcome to Financial Planning Week. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Financial Planning Association of Los Angeles and the Los Angeles Public Library. Today's presenter from the FBA is Katrina Solter. She is the Director of Wealth Management at KCS Wealth Advisory. She is a CFP practitioner. Hi, Katrina, with a special interest in helping people find the balance between enjoying their present and planning for their future. She will be exploring the universal reality of retirement and providing many savings and retirement options individuals can rely on when planning for the future. She will also offer information relevant to each stage of a working adult professional life. So we have a brief Q&A after the presentation, so please send us your questions throughout the program. Thank you, and take it away, Katrina.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to be able to share some education and knowledge around retirement planning. And thank you so much for the Los Angeles Library for putting on this wonderful event. I know all of us here with FPA, Financial Planners Association, are excited to be able to volunteer and provide some hopefully really useful information tonight at this event. Like Caroline mentioned, please feel free to add comments, questions. We will definitely take those as they come in. I love to be able to explore any of your questions while we're going through the content to make sure that we're really answering it in real time on the slides that are most impactful about those particular answers. And we'll also have time for a Q&A at the end as well in case we miss anything during the presentation. So for today's event, we're talking about real-world retirement planning. Retirement is really a time of change. There are a lot of different definitions of retirement. There are a lot of different ways in which people envision what retirement will look like. And there are lots of different ways in which we're thinking about the word retirement nowadays. I often will substitute financial independence instead of retirement because some people want to keep working through their retirement. They like their job, they want to keep going, and they are looking to work throughout their retirement, but they're looking for that sense of financial independence, that their future is not dependent on that continued work. Whereas others are looking for early retirement and looking for that financial independence even earlier than traditional retirement age. So the definition of retirement can be very widely different according to you and your own personal journey. So that's really the first step, is to identify what is your definition of retirement and then what will be different for you, both personally and financially, once you enter into that transitionary phase and that next step. What's it gonna look like from your own personal life? How are you going to spend your time? What are you going to engage in different activities? How will you align how you're spending your time with your own values and with what brings you joy? And then what is it going to look like from a financial perspective? We know that financial stress is one of the top reasons for folks' stress. And so we definitely don't want to move into a time where we traditionally rely on our financial assets with a lot of worry and stress around those financial assets, because it could take away from some of that personal enjoyment. So those are different pieces we'll explore together today during this presentation. We're also going to cover a lot about how to save for retirement, which different vehicles are most effective in saving for retirement, and then how do we address the spending in retirement. And spending in retirement in particular is really an important piece of the retirement picture, because what are we really planning for when we're talking about retirement? We're usually planning for how we're going to replace the income that we currently use while we're working to cover our expenses. So the biggest expense we're planning to cover in retirement is actually our day-to-day living expenses. So we're going to talk about how we look at those expenses and how we figure out that spending. We know now that it is not your parents' retirement. So the retirement that your parents or grandparents enjoyed is no longer the reality. It's not what we're living in. There is way more dependence on your own personal savings and investments. Almost no pensions, unless hopefully you're getting one if you work in a government job. But there is a real reduction in the amount of pensions that are being accrued. And even in the traditionally pension paying sectors, those pensions are being potentially reduced, or the amount of guarantees are reduced, or not the amount of guarantees, but the amount of money that you're receiving per month may be reduced for newer workers. So, and just to be clear, there are lots of guarantees and lots of different things about pensions, but we can talk a little bit about that side of things as we go into the rest of the slides. It can also feel very uncertain to think about Social Security. Social Security, as we know as a system, is there's a lot in the news and a lot of headlines around whether or not Social Security will be around, what it's going to look like, how much funding it has based on how many people are currently working versus how many people are taking Social Security. So there's some uncertainty there, which again puts even more of an onus on your own personal savings and investing. We know that people are also working for longer. They have more working years typically, but they also have a much longer life expectancy. So whereas in 1990, the average life expectancy at age 65 for a woman was 84.1 years, and for a man was 80.1 years, in 2090, it's expected to be 89.5 and 87.5. And even up in 2016, we saw an increase there by a couple of years for each of those categories. So we can see that because our life expectancy is increasing and continuing to grow, we're also seeing possibly a much longer retirement time frame, which means that we have more years where we need to cover those expenses. So we have a little quiz to start you off and something to test your knowledge. So we're going to go through each of these to see if it's true or false and whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. So the first one is Medicare is free for retirees. True or false? Probably have an answer in your head. So yes and no. Parts of Medicare are free for retirees, but there are other parts that are actually included as a deduction from your Social Security payment. So you have to pay for Medicare Part B. There are different pieces to Medicare that are not entirely free because there is a bit of a premium that you do pay out of that Social Security paycheck that usually is then covering that Medicare section. Next one. Medicare covers long-term care costs, true or false? And long-term care, right, we're defining as care when you really can't care for yourself anymore, like in-home care or a nursing facility. And that is actually false. Medicare does not cover long-term care costs. Medicare instead covers your health insurance and healthcare costs, but long-term care costs are on your own. There are some options through the state of California where you can potentially receive state-provided care. Specifically in California, Medi-Cal can cover some types of facilities and some types of long-term care costs, but you are on the hook and you have to have a very, very low amount in assets to be able to receive those benefits. So that's one idea we're going to dispel right here. Next one, your regular 401k account is worth $100,000, so you have $100,000 to spend. True or false? Can you go out and spend $100,000 if you have $100,000 in your 401k? No, not exactly, because the money that comes out of your 401k is actually taxable to you when you take those withdrawals. So when you pull money out of your 401k, you owe income tax on it. And if you're under 59.5, you potentially owe a 10% penalty as well for those withdrawals. So that 401k, regular traditional 401k, is not actually worth all $100,000 because there's some taxes due to the government. So you can't go spend every single dime in there. Next one, even if you are covered by 401k or a 403b plan at work, you can still contribute to your own traditional IRA account. True or false? So this one is partially true. There are income limitations that if you are covered by a 401k or 403b plan at work, depending on how much money you make, you may be able to make a deductible contribution to your traditional IRA account. And if you can't make a deductible contribution, you may be able to make an after-tax or non-deductible contribution to a traditional IRA account. So there's some caveats there. It gets a little bit murky, but it's definitely something where you have to do some of that digging to make sure your income is within those limits. Next one, if you were married for 10 years, got divorced, and haven't remarried, you can claim Social Security benefits based on your ex-spouse. True or false? This one is true. You can actually claim benefits based on your ex-spouse's record under Social Security laws. That said, you do have to be cognizant of what your own record may earn you. So you do have to get into some of the nitty-gritty details of whether or not Social Security benefits are higher under your own record versus that of your ex-spouse. But let's say you got divorced and you hadn't been the spouse that was working during the years of the marriage, and so your Social Security benefit is much lower than the amount you'd be entitled to as a spouse. You actually can claim under your ex-spouse's record. It doesn't change their benefit at all. It doesn't reduce or change the benefit that your ex-spouse would receive. So there's no vindication in that way, but there is an ability to get the benefit that you had accrued as a spouse during that period of that marriage. Next one, you may be taxed on up to 50% or up to 85% of your Social Security benefits. True or false? This one is true. Yes, your Social Security benefits are potentially taxable depending on the amount of total income that you report on your tax return in that particular tax year. So the more income, the more of your Social Security benefits that fall under the taxable amount. The highest amount that your Social Security benefits that may be subject to taxation is 85%. Next one, if you don't enroll in parts of Medicare within certain windows, you could face lifelong premium penalties. True or false? This one is an interesting one because there are certain parts of Medicare and particularly Medigap policies where, yes, you can face premium penalties depending on when you enroll in it. So, and whether or not you have an exception to the time frame, the window in which you're required to enroll. So the Medicare in particular and Medigap plans, which are supplemental insurance plans that cover any gaps in the Medicare policies themselves. Those are both things where you need to be aware of when it makes sense to enroll. And usually it's the 6 months surrounding your 65th birthday. So the 3 months before and the 3 months after and the month of. So that time frame is when you're really wanting to be aware of it. Definitely get on the front end of that. Make sure you have time to sort through all of the different policies and different options available to you. Okay, so now that we've gone through our little test, let's talk about the two phases of retirement. Typically we think about the lifestyle, which is the traditional concept, right? This is where we're traveling, we're working, we're volunteering, we're visiting with folks, we're really living our best life, right? This is the lifestyle that we've always envisioned. We hopefully now have the financial freedom to really pay for that, but you may also be careful with your cash flow and your expenses. And a lot of folks are trying to maintain their nest egg during this period of time. Often this is when we're doing a lot of the investment work. We're making sure that our investments are working for us to support that lifestyle that we're living in retirement. The next step is legacy. The next phase of retirement is legacy. And this is really at the latter end of that retirement picture. And it's the one we don't like to talk about as much. This is where our health is potentially declining. We have a lot of lifestyle changes. We're slowing down. Maybe we're cutting back on that travel. We're not able to move as well as we used to. And we may also be considering or needing long-term care services, that in-home care, nursing facility, or some sort of location or people to help us take care of our daily living needs. We may be looking at a longevity annuity, which is a type of a product that would provide income during our lifetime. And we may also be, hopefully, engaging in estate planning. Estate planning is our topic tomorrow evening. So if you're interested in learning more about estate planning, there's a really wonderful presentation that we're putting on through Financial Planning Week at the Los Angeles Library on estate planning tomorrow evening. And estate planning is particularly important because it's what makes sure that what happens with your assets and everything you worked hard to accrue goes where you want it to go after you pass away. And if you're saying, well, I don't care, I'll be dead, which is what I've heard a lot in my office, then it's also important to remember that the onus of dealing and the burden of dealing with untangling all of those pieces falls on your loved ones after you pass away. So your loved ones are going to have that work to do if you don't do some estate planning. Estate planning makes it easier for them because they don't have to get tied up in court and pay a huge probate fee in order to take care of your estate. So I often talk about estate planning is the best love letter you can ever write to your family and friends. I heard that from an estate planning attorney once, and I think it's a great line. So those are the two phases of retirement. We like to talk a lot about the lifestyle one. We hesitate to talk about the legacy one, but it's extremely important to plan for those moments because it's also a really scary time, and we want to make sure that we're prepared in advance of taking that retirement to cover those topics. And as you get ready to retire, you want to know your spending. I mentioned that this is the piece we're looking to replace financially when we talk about retirement. We move from having income that's going to cover all of our expenses to having to use our assets or our pension or our Social Security to cover all of those expenses. The expenses that you spend in your daily lifestyle are the biggest amount of money that you are planning for in retirement. Way more so than any special travel or trips, way more so than even your long-term care needs. The total that amount of money that you will spend to maintain your lifestyle is usually the biggest amount of money that we're planning to provide for when we're doing retirement planning. And we really split that into two pieces. The first is your basic or essential spending. This is your food, clothing, housing, your prescriptions, insurance premiums, everything that you need to maintain your basic life. Then extra or discretionary spending is above that, everything on top of that. That's the enjoyment factor, travel, gifts, grandkids, concerts, anything, hobbies, even possibly volunteer experiences. You may want to have money that you're spending on, classes you might take. All of that extra or discretionary spending is the top layer that comes into it with regards to the expenses. So how do you go about figuring out what those expenses are going to be? It's a really tricky number to get clear on, especially if you've not been a big fan of budgeting in your lifetime. But you have to be able to get somewhat clear about what those costs are going to be because that's really the nuts and bolts of retirement planning. You have to make your best estimate, and you can get really detailed. There are some lovely Excel spreadsheets out there to help you nail this down. But you can also do this based on an estimate of your pre-retirement income, assuming you're spending money within those pre-retirement income limits. Keep in mind, certain expenses are going to be lower, like any job-related costs. Maybe you've paid down the mortgage. Maybe you don't have kids in the house anymore, so you don't have those expenses. But you may have additional costs that could be higher, potentially healthcare costs or home maintenance. Maybe you want to do a major upgrade on your home. Utilities, the taxes may grow over time. Hobbies, travel, leisure, all that stuff that's going to fill up all that free time you have once you're not working, that may cost some money. So you want to make sure you're prepared for that as well. One way that we can talk about how to estimate your retirement taxes costs is going to be to look at your pre-retirement income and estimate that your expenses will be somewhere between 75% to 100% of your pre-retirement income. So here's how you work out those numbers. This is the math. Welcome back to elementary school, right? Do some multiplication here. If your current annual income is $65,000, 75% of that would be $48,750 per year. That would be your typical yearly expenses. If you're going to estimate that to replace your current lifestyle is going to take about 75% of your current annual income. Let's say you're saying, no, I actually want to be on the higher end of my current annual income. I'm going to estimate it at 90%. So 90% of that $65,000 total is going to be that $58,500 number. That's your first year need. Notice we're saying estimated first year need. The reason why we're not saying that's every year's need is because you have to add an inflation factor. The cost of our lives does increase over time as the cost of things increases. We've heard a lot about inflation in the news recently. We can think about what's the cost of gas from 1990 to what the cost of gas is now, the cost of a cup of coffee, the cost of a sandwich. Each of these different items increases in total cost over time. That's inflation at work. And so that estimated first year need, we have to add an inflation factor so that we are planning for what that inflation increase might be year over year. So let me go back here and just finalize this by saying, when we're going through the numbers, if you're a person who likes to be very detail oriented, highly recommend pulling out that handy trusty Excel spreadsheet and really looking at your monthly numbers from the last year. If you're a person who wants to sort of estimate it instead, you can backwards into it using these percent estimations. That's another way to figure out what your total cost might be. This is, like I said, a key component of the retirement plan. So getting clear on your current and your estimated retirement expenses is going to be really helpful. One item to keep in mind, or a couple items to keep in mind as you think about what that number is going to be, making sure that you take into account the possibility of buying a new car down the road. You may have to replace your car time and again. Making sure that you have money in the budget to maintain your house or fix any major issues that come up that may cost money, like a new roof or having to repair the windows or something. And then making sure that you're also paying attention to what the total travel cost is. What are those extras and how they might change over time between now and when you might be aging. And then finally, those healthcare costs in the later ages of retirement, making sure we're planning for those as well. So there's a couple of those items that are outside of the box are just, oh, this is how much I spend every year, that may be worthwhile to take a closer look at. Okay, so we talked about the spending. So now let's talk a little bit about how we think about retirement, because there are some risks when we're thinking about retirement. We're going along da-di-da and everything's going well, but then suddenly, unexpectedly, my work ends, right? I'm now forced into retirement. So this is a risk that happens quite regularly, and it could be due to health issues. It could be due to a layoff. It could be due to caregiving responsibilities. And we found there's a survey that took place in 2019 from the Employee Benefit Research Institute, and it found that 43% of people retired earlier than planned. And there's a breakdown here of what that was due to: health, disabilities, downsizing or closures at the company, by the way, not downsizing their house, and downsizing or closures at the company, and caregiving responsibilities. So a lot of folks who will insist that their retirement plan is just to work until they die, sometimes we can't. So working a little longer generally has a much bigger impact if you're behind than saving more aggressively at the end. So you want to protect your income from a disability perspective or income insurance so that you can be making sure that you can afford to continue to work and make sure that you can continue to replace that income should it be necessary. And this is also why you'll notice this little sentence here that saving more aggressively at the end isn't necessarily as beneficial to the plan in retirement as working a little bit longer. And that saving more aggressively at the end can't always make up the difference of what you didn't save at the beginning. Another reason we're going to talk a little bit about different ways to save for retirement in a few slides. And here it is. So we're going to talk about the different types of savings vehicles. There are a variety of different options available to you. The first and most common that we often hear about a lot are employer-sponsored plans. Employer-sponsored plans, that's your 401k, your 403b, pensions, those types of plans are going to be one of the key components of building that retirement savings. Why is this so important? Those employer-sponsored plans are really, really useful because they are usually matching what you are yourself contributing. So your employer is putting in money while you are also putting in money. So when we're putting in both contributions, it's going to help build that savings more aggressively. And it's something we don't want to leave that free money on the table. It's usually part of our benefits package to be eligible for those employer matching contributions. So making sure you're contributing as well to take advantage of that match is going to be really important in building your retirement savings. It's also the vehicle under which we can often put the most amount of savings in the most tax deferred or tax-free savings as well. We also have individual retirement accounts. If your employer doesn't have a plan, if you want to save even more money, like we talked about earlier, or if you're a gig worker or working in an economy by yourself or self-employed, opening an IRA account can be a really beneficial way to build that retirement savings. And the cool thing is, if you leave a job, you can roll your money into an IRA if you wanted to manage it on your own. So there's some flexibility between employer-sponsored plans and individual retirement accounts because they share tax characteristics. There's also simplified employee pension, a SEP or KEO plan. Those are usually available to you if you are self-employed, if you run your own business, or if you have a small business with few employees. Those offer higher contribution amounts under the employer-sponsored plans than like an employer-sponsored plan might also offer. And so that's why they're available to those self-employed or small businesses to sort of supplement or provide an option available to those folks who wouldn't otherwise be able to contribute the higher dollars that could go into an employer-sponsored plan. And then we also see annuities, both fixed and variable. Annuities are a form of insurance product that are insuring income streams for your future. So what does that mean? That basically means if you put in money to an annuity, then down the road in retirement, you can turn on, like a spigot, you can turn on a stream of income. And those can be both fixed and variable. Fixed means that you only accrue a certain amount per the annuities formula every single year. Variable means that you could even invest those funds in the market. Annuities can be powerful if you're looking for an income replacement stream, but you do need to be very aware of the fees and the restrictions that are tied into those accounts. There may be less flexibility, and it may be harder to get your money back out than in some of the other accounts. So it sometimes is harder to use an annuity to do things like a one-off expense, like the roof needs replacing. And so you just need to be really thoughtful about how you're using all of these different vehicles when you're building your savings. Taxable investment portfolios are our last option here. That when we say that, there's a lot of lingo in the industry, and I think a lot of folks find this particular piece confusing. This is if you open an investment account just under your own name or in you and your spouse's name and started putting money into stocks or bonds through that account. It's not through your employer. It's not in an IRA. It's not in any of these other vehicles. It's just simply an account in your own name, and you're using that account to then go invest in the stock or bond market. When you do that, because when we talk about the type of account dictates what happens from a tax perspective to the investments in that account. When we have an account that's just in our own name, and it doesn't have any of these other features or other types of vehicles surrounding it and wrapping around it, then that means that all of the transactions that happen in that account are taxable in the year that they occur. That means any dividends that are paid on your stocks, any interest paid on your bonds, if you sell a stock and have a capital gain, everything will be taxable in the year that it occurs in that straight, pure account that's just in your own name. And that's why it's a taxable investment portfolio, because the transactions inside are taxable in the year that they occur. They're invested in a portfolio. So you can invest in any one of these types of structures. You can put money into stocks and bonds in any one of these different types of accounts. The account wrapping, the type of account that it's in, is what dictates the outcome from a tax perspective, what happens to the taxes but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be, investing in stocks or bonds, or you can or can't invest in stocks and bonds in any of these. You can invest in any of these accounts. What happens to the taxes is what's determined by the type of account, not what you can or can't invest in. I hope that was clear. All right, so let's talk about how we modify your approach over time, particularly with how we're saving and how we're investing. So in your 30s, we want to be aggressive, and we want to invest at least 10% of your income and put that long-term plan in place. It's also, and you're going to see this all along here, I actually think you should be making an estate plan at the age of 18, because that's when your parents can no longer make healthcare decisions for you without a healthcare directive, a healthcare power of attorney. And so putting into place some basic estate planning documents as early as possible can be really beneficial. We definitely want to update that and make a plan when you're in your 30s. This is usually when we have assets that will be difficult to transfer at passing. So we want to make sure that we're following those. In our 40s is when we then get to be a little bit more aggressive as well, and we want to invest up to 15% of income, or even a little bit higher, especially if you're looking to retire early. We want to balance these competing goals. This is this balance between enjoying the present and planning for the future across all of these different time frames, right? Investing into the future is really, really important, but it can't stop you from enjoying your life now. We have to have both. What we found is that people who save super aggressively and are very, very, down to the bone when it comes to their expenses in their earlier years, in an attempt to really save as much as they possibly can, once they get to the time when they can enjoy it, they don't know how, because they've been saving so aggressively. They never really learned how to spend money. But that's also true on the reverse, right? If you spend everything you make and you're not doing any savings, then down the road, when you get to the time when you want to just be enjoying and not having to work anymore, there's nothing there. And you have to either save really, really aggressively to make up for it, or work a lot longer. So we have to find that balancing act between enjoying what we're doing now and planning for that future. So we also, and in our 40s in particular, we tend to have a lot of competing goals. We might have a mortgage. We might be in the pinnacle of our career, really growing our career. We might have kids. We might have aging parents that we're caring for. There's a lot of competing interests here. We might have a spouse. You're really, really busy in your 40s is what we're getting. So in your 50s, then we might have a little bit more flexibility because, maybe our kids are growing up. We have gotten into a really steady place when it comes to putting our investments in place and saving for things and in our career. And so we can be a little bit more cautious. We might also be making a lot more money, so we can invest more of it. We often are seeing people do a bulk of their savings for retirement in their 50s. Would it be even more helpful in your 30s? Yes. But again, there's that balancing act. So investing 20% of income in your 50s is usually our recommended number, and making sure that we're investing any inheritance. Sometimes people get an inheritance, they sit on it in cash. The problem with cash, of course, is that we talked about inflation earlier. Cash does not earn very much money. It's very hard for money in cash to keep up with the rising cost of things. So we have to be considering how to invest those pieces. And then how do we consider long-term care insurance? This is a time when we are most able to afford usually, and are ready to start thinking about how to afford long-term care insurance. And long-term care insurance, of course, pays for long-term care costs in our older age. And then in our 60s, we're producing that income. We continue to own those stocks. We might start spending down some assets, and we are definitely updating our estate plan. And I would argue that we want to be updating our estate plan every 5 years or so, just revisiting it to make sure that it makes sense still. Okay, I talked about how the account determines the taxes. So taxes, the type of account that you're holding investments in is the wrapper around which your investments are held. It's the wrapper around your investments. The investments themselves all have different tax consequences. But if your account type, the wrapper, is a traditional IRA, then it's going to be in the center section. It's going to be taxed later. All of that growth, all of the dividends, all the interest, all the capital gains, none of that actually matters in a traditional IRA in the year that it happens, because you only get taxed when you take money out of the account. That's when the taxes hit. Versus when we're sitting in that taxable investment account, when that's the wrapper, when it's in our own name or in just a regular investment account, then that wrapper is going to flow through the taxes onto our tax return each year as those transactions occur. So that's where it's taxed now. And that's where you see the immediate consequences of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, any interest from bank deposits, and any interest from savings accounts. That all will be taxed now when held inside of that regular account. So that's where we tax now. Taxing later is all of these traditional types of retirement accounts. And then taxing never, assuming this stays the way that it is according to the new tax laws, are some of these other items. And there are some characteristics here based on your income. But Roth IRAs accounts and Roth 401k accounts, for example, the money you take out is not taxable to you when you take it out. That said, when you put the money into a Roth account, it's after-tax income at the time that you put it in. So your contributions do not get you a deduction on your tax return. They do not reduce your taxable income in the year you make the contribution, whereas a traditional IRA, that does reduce your income in the year that you make the contribution. So that's the balancing act between a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA. Traditional IRA, you get the deduction now, you pay the taxes later. A Roth IRA, you get the deduction, no deduction now, you don't pay the taxes later. Municipal bonds, depending on your tax bracket, can be tax-free at a federal level and sometimes also tax-free at a state level, any interest that's accrued. Granted, the yields are quite low right now because of interest rates, but definitely an attractive option, possibly down the road. And possibly, depending on your tax bracket, also could still currently be an attractive option. Cash value life insurance, because you can take money out of the value that's accrued in your life insurance policy. Tax exempt mutual funds, and then 529 plans, assuming 529 plans, by the way, what are those? Those are college savings accounts. So college savings accounts, when you take the money out to use for qualified education expenses, you get to have that money, all of the growth on those investments comes out tax-free. Okay, we got a lot to get through and not a lot of time, so I got to keep talking fast here. So we talked about taxable investments, and we're going to go through this in a little bit more detail here, right? This is that wrapper where it's just in your own name or that of you and your spouse. It could also be in the name of a trust if you've done your estate planning. And a trust really is just a vehicle that you have established that dictates what would happen to your assets if you were to pass away, but it's really under your same control during your lifetime. And so those taxable investments, there's no contribution limits, no withdrawal rules, meaning you can contribute as much as you want, you can take out as much as you want. You're free to make any investments. It's a great way to diversify your portfolio, and it's a great way to create additional income for down the road or create additional savings for your future. It's also a really great intermediate bucket. If you're like, I really want to save for a house that I want to buy in 10 years, this is a great vehicle for that. Earnings are also taxed at a lower than regular rate. So when we talk about capital gains, there are both short-term and long-term capital gains. That's when you sell a stock. Let's say you bought it at $10 and you sell it for $30. The difference that you made, that $20 of money that you made, that $20, if you held on to the stock for a year and a day after you originally bought it, that $20 of growth that you just created for yourself is taxed at long-term capital gains rates, which are much, much lower, usually 10, 15, 0 or 15 or 20%, so much lower rate. Whereas if you held it within a year, then within just 1 year, you're going to end up with paying income tax rates on that. So that's flows through, everything flows through on taxable investments to your tax return in the year that it happens. Tax deferred plans, this is all growth, everything that's earned, all of the growth, all the dividends, all the interest, everything grows tax deferred in tax deferred plans, meaning that you're just not paying the tax right now. You won't pay any taxes until you take the money out. It then will be taxed at your regular income rate at withdrawal. Some contributions are tax deferred, meaning that you don't pay taxes now, you get a deduction now, and then they're taxed at your regular income rate when you take the money out. There are limits depending on the type of plan. There are contribution limits, and there are some withdrawal rules, but they do vary a little bit. But usually, on the whole, you are paying an additional 10% penalty on any withdrawals before age 59 and a half. And usually you are required after age 72 to start taking money out. These are called required minimum distributions, RMDs, required minimum distributions. You're required to start taking money out of these tax deferred plans starting at age 72. It used to be 70 and a half, and then the Secure Act changed that age. Okay. Make the most of your employer's plan. Make sure that you contribute as much as you can. Diversify among your plan choices. Reallocate annually as part of an overall review. And make sure that you're rolling your assets over to an IRA or a new job when you leave your job. That's because you don't want to lose track of old 401k plans or old employer plans. So you want to make sure that you're really taking advantage of those. Like I mentioned, these are often where you will see a match from your employer for the amount that you get some amount from them into the plan as long as you contribute a certain amount. Don't leave free money on the table. Really important. And this is exactly where we avoid those mistakes. Failing to participate is the biggest one I see, where people just don't sign up, they don't start contributing, or they don't contribute enough to actually get the full match. For example, an employer might say, I will match 3% as long as you put in 3%. You have to put in 3% to get the 3%. Don't put in 1% or 2%. You want to get the full 3%. You can also often borrow from your 401k plan, depending on the structure of the plan. But if you do that, you have to be aware that you're taking away from that growth over time. Or cashing out early, just taking money out of it. That's often a mistake we see folks making because they need the funds. And it's certainly a worst case option, but it's definitely not recommended. It can often really shoot yourself in the foot in terms of the growth of the portfolio. Tax-free plans, we talked about these. Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, and Roth 403bs. They're similar but different in that you're contributing after-tax income, right? So you don't get a deduction when you make the money, put the money into the account, but you get all that money out tax-free as long as you follow the rules. You have to be at least 59 and a half, and you have to have the account open at least 5 years with money in it. A Roth IRA is a little different than a Roth 401k in a couple of different ways. The Roth IRA is, you really need to make sure you're following that 5-year rule, and you can open a Roth IRA well in advance of when you might need it so that you're not age 59 and a half, opening a Roth IRA, moving over your Roth 401k, and now restarting that 5-year clock. So being thoughtful about when to open that. Roth IRAs have a limit based on your total income as to how much you can contribute to them. Whereas Roth 401ks, it's not based on your income, it's just whether or not your employer offers it, and then you can put money into it up to the same amount as you would into a regular 401k, so a much higher number. So that's a main difference, is how much you can contribute and whether or not it's capped based on your total income. There are different withdrawal rules as well. They're required from employer plans. So a Roth 401k, you are required to start taking those distributions. And then it's not required from a Roth IRA. You don't actually have to start taking those minimum distributions. So that's a big reason why we see a lot of people roll over a Roth 401k to a Roth IRA in retirement, so they can avoid having those withdrawal requirements. This is just a quick chart that shows those differences in terms of contributions, whether you get the deduction or not, what happens to the earnings, and then whether the withdrawals are taxed or not. So just to recap here, the differences between those types of accounts. How do you make the most of your IRA? This is a simple formula. We want to contribute as much as you can based on the limits and how much you can afford to contribute. Diversify your investments broadly and rebalance them annually. make sure to consider a Roth IRA for new contributions, and then convert existing IRAs, 401ks, and 403bs. You can move them into a Roth IRA. Keep in mind that taxes are due at conversion, so please be careful with this. Don't just go around taking all your traditional IRAs and moving them into Roth IRAs without consulting a tax advisor or a financial advisor first. But that and keep in mind that the 5-year period may begin again, so just be careful with those conversions, but it is an option to make those moves. Moving into investing, because this is a really important piece of how we plan for retirement. And allocations really do matter. We want to look at the big picture, both from an allocation perspective in terms of which types of accounts, how they're being taxed, but then also the underlying investments of how we're investing underneath that. So looking at the big picture of which types of accounts are we putting money in, tax deferred, tax free, taxable, and then what are we invested in terms of the portfolio. Sometimes in retirement, we want to be a little bit more conservative because we're a little bit worried or we don't need to take as much risk as we did when we were young, because now we're actually starting to withdraw money. So it can make much more sense to take down that risk a little bit in the portfolio. We also might move some money into income producing investments like bonds, certain mutual funds. And we also want to think about the amount we want to invest for some growth. If you're retiring at 60, odds are you're going to be around for at least another 25 years, if not 35. And so we want to make sure that you're not just moving everything into cash or bonds because you have a much longer time horizon. You're not just going to take all the money out the first year. You got to plan for that 25, 35 year horizon of retirement. So I often think of retirement as the date at which we're done investing, but actually we are lifelong investors. And investing is what allows our retirement to keep pace with inflation over that 25 and 35 year time horizon. So here's where we want to think about the retirement planning process. What's essential is if you can retire, when can you retire, and what it will look like, and then how will you pass on what's left, right? So there's all these different 4 pieces of this pie that we want to make sure we're covering. What's our protection? What's essential to plan for? What's that legacy, and what's that lifestyle? There are a variety of sources of income that we might be able to draw down from when it comes to retirement. Withdrawals from retirement savings plans, that's what we've just been talking about, all those different vehicles, all those different wrappers, those are your savings plans. Social Security, like we talked about before, interest, dividends, or other investment accounts, right? Income, part-time work. I know lots of folks who've successfully worked in terms of part-time work. And then investment principal. You can actually take out some of your principal. You don't just have to think about income. I often think about it as an entire pot, right? You don't just have to live on the interest and dividends. You can look at the total pot of money that you have saved and figure out the best withdrawal strategy for you. It's not just limited to how much it's throwing off in interest. You can be thoughtful about taking advantage of the growth of those stocks and taking advantage of some of those earnings. Really looking at that entire pot of money as the source of your retirement income and how much is it sustainable to withdraw from that pot of money each year. But it doesn't have to just be limited to interest and dividends and just investment income. So it's important to keep in mind the reason you're investing those stocks for that growth is to keep pace with inflation, and you need to be able to access some of that growth over time, particularly in our low interest rate environment. And then the final one here that's actually not on the list is definitely pensions, if you are so lucky to have one. I mentioned we would talk about this later. Pensions, of course, are usually basically backed by the plan that your employer is providing. So one thing here is, pensions we often think of as being guaranteed. And to some degree, there is a backup plan if your pension plan were to fail. Because there is a pension guarantee fund that these pensions have to pay into, and it would replace a certain amount of your pension up to a certain percentage. So there is a backup plan in case something were to go awry. But it's also important as an employee to be aware of the health of the pension plan that you're paying into and to be holding your employer accountable to that. So, one of the things we've learned is pensions are a really powerful tool for retirement income planning. And we've seen a lot of successful retirements and retirees using pensions. But we also have seen a few cases where those pensions plans were not supported correctly, and it's caused a lot of angst. So we really want to be thoughtful about how we as employees are questioning our employers to make sure that there's safety there and our retirement plans are solid. And it also, again, is important to keep in mind how we want to save for ourselves in potential other savings vehicles to provide for that supplemental retirement. It's also really important to maintain an emergency fund. An emergency fund is usually 6 to 12 months worth of your living expenses, is often in retirement. What I recommend, it can be 3 to 6 months as well. That's another option. Basically, this is available in case you have unexpected expenses. I keep talking about these roofs. Maybe you want to buy a roof. Maybe you need to buy a new car. There are these options available then because you have cash there. It's also great in terms of a market downturn. We saw this happen in March of last year when COVID hit, and having that extra cash can help people weather a downturn in the market for a period of time to feel like they can, let it recover a little bit more before accessing more of their funds. It needs to be easily accessible in savings and cash equivalent investments. And here we're even saying for a year or two. You just want to make sure that you're in a higher yielding savings account for that longer period of time. So maybe there's two chunks. There's your really, really liquid, or it's all in a high yield savings account, because honestly, they're not earning that much either. 0.5 is really the number. 0.5% is what I'm usually seeing these days. But we want to be looking for something that's going to earn just a teensy bit on that cash. So we've got something. We're getting paid to sit in cash a little bit. There are a couple of different income strategies. You can be a systematic withdrawal. You're just sort of drawing down over time. You can have 3 buckets. This is kind of what the idea that we were just talking about. That emergency fund or cash bucket, that's for the first 2 years or the next 2 years of your retirement income. Then the intermediate bucket, maybe it's medium risk. And then your longer term bucket, that's going to be for your longer term and it's riskier, perhaps more stocks invested. So your really safe funds, that's for the first couple years. Your intermediate money that's taking a medium amount of risk, and then you can kind of, pour money across those different buckets. And then there's also folks that use a baseline. They have like a baseline that they can, spend. That's their baseline living expenses. And then when markets are good, they spend more. When markets are bad, they retreat back to that baseline. So there can be a variable income structure as well, which can have, there's some really interesting studies that have shown that if you can emotionally withstand that variation, it can be a really powerful way to elongate your portfolio over time. So how do we do this? We got to, create a retirement income strategy, and we want to make sure that we're taking the required withdrawals from our employer plans and IRAs. Got to be aware of what all of these rules are. And then there's a total annual withdrawal rate. That's the recommended level. So when I was talking about that pot of money, if we're looking at all of our retirement savings, what's called a quote unquote safe withdrawal rate is 3 to 4% of your total portfolio. So if we sort of take the amount that you've got invested and we add it all together, there's usually a quote unquote recommended withdrawal rate is about 3% to 4% of the portfolio each year. And you can increase that annually by the rate of inflation, and hopefully your portfolio is also growing. And then if necessary, you can begin to use investment principal to meet those income needs. There are some particular risks to be aware of, particularly if you spend too quickly, especially in a bad market. There's this worry about how your portfolio may do. Historically, stocks may have earned 8% over time, but this does not mean you can spend 8% each year if you need that money to last as long as it needs to. So that's where this 3 to 4% is an appropriate withdrawal rate from your portfolio. So now if you're much on the older side, or if you're willing to cut back in bad times, go back to your baseline, you may be able to withdraw more when the markets are doing well and then pull it back. Or if you have a really short time horizon, you may be able to pull more as well. So let's say, for example, you retire at 65 and your account is worth $200,000. Can you live on 4% of $200,000, which is $8,000 per year, plus the money from Social Security, about $17,000, to a total of $25,532? That's the question. So that's where this withdrawal risk and withdrawal rate really matters, and why it behooves you to really take a look at that retirement plan and where these income sources are coming from. There's also a concern around sequence of returns. Negative returns that happen near retirement can add a lot of risk to portfolio failure. So investment returns are unpredictable, we know this, and the order of how your returns happen can have a significant impact on you. So if you retire and you retire into a bear market, meaning that the market is down during the years that you first retire, and you have money that you have to take out money from your portfolio in order to live, it can really diminish the amount that's there that's left to then recover and compound into your future. So that's why saving that emergency fund, saving that rainy day fund can provide that cash backup that allows the rest of your more risky investments to recover and grow back, to ride that market recovery. And recent research suggests that building bonds and cash as you approach retirement and then steadily increasing your stock allocation as you age may be the best approach. But if you are lucky to have a pension, then you might be shielded to some extent from this risk. So that steady income can be a differentiating factor in the sequence of returns. So what happens if you're sitting here and you're going, oh gosh, I've got all of this stuff going on and I'm feeling really worried and I don't know, I have to catch up because I'm not going to be able to make this happen. You can work a little bit longer, you can save a little bit more, you can invest better, and you can stay healthy. And there are always choices. I tell people it may not be the choice that you want, but there are always choices in front of us. So you would just have to weigh the pros and cons. You may not get everything, but maybe we can get some of those things. So you need to know what you'd like to do. You need to figure that out sooner rather than later. Would you be willing to work longer? Do you want to do part-time work? What is that going to look like? And then figuring out when you're going to take your Social Security and how you're going to do that is really important. You do get a benefit by waiting until later years to be able to get a higher percentage payout of your Social Security. So there is a benefit to waiting a little bit longer past your full retirement age to get your Social Security. And maybe that's the method that works, working a little bit longer and letting that Social Security continue to build up. Then you have to know what you spend and figure out what's going on, what's really important to you. And this is really where I recommend folks go through with a fine-tooth comb and identify which expenses really align with their values and with the lifestyle they want to live. Even taking out a highlighter and highlighting the things that you really agree with, those expenses, you really valued that expense, versus the ones you don't even remember why you did that or you don't even remember what it was for. And rather than, quitting cold turkey, maybe you can work, part-time or at the same job, you can slow down a little bit more. And if you're closer to retirement, another year or two will do a lot more good for you than saving an extra $5,000. So those are a couple of ideas when you're in that position of needing to play catch up. And if you're going to be working, you may want to continue with your former employer, or you may want to switch to a new area of interest. You could even volunteer some of your time as well and keep those Social Security income limits in mind if you retire at less than full retirement age and claim Social Security early. Other things to consider, we covered some of these, but long-term health care, the wills and living wills, your estate planning, and any inheritance taxes that may happen. We're seeing some new laws out, or proposed laws that haven't yet been adopted, I should say, that may change the estate tax exemption limits. So it's something to be aware of if you haven't looked at estate planning yet. May be worthwhile to explore depending on the total amount of assets that you have and how you're sitting on everything. So to recap, what is best practice? Building an emergency fund, building that buffer before you retire, maximizing your retirement opportunities, adding to those additional retirement accounts, investing in taxable accounts, monitoring your future and investing well, maximizing any group benefits like disability income, maintaining life insurance if you have dependents or any other death benefit needs, and building that financial resilience so that you can withstand volatility or changes in the economy into your retirement. Here are some suggested reading and resources that may be useful for you as you're looking for what to do next. And keep in mind, some local community colleges frequently offer investing, retirement, or personal finance classes for adults as well. as well as this lovely and enjoyable session we've had here today. Thank you so much for your time. Plannersearch.org has a database of CFP professionals, and you can filter for the type of person that you want. And we're also having Financial Planning Day on Saturday, so you can get to talk to one of us for free for half an hour. It's a really exciting time. And we really appreciate your attendance here today. And we'll take any questions at this time. I know we're running right at the edge of time, so we had a lot to cover tonight.
Yes, that was a ton of information. Thank you so much. So, hi, I'm Madeline, and I also work in the Office of Civics and Community Services here at the Los Angeles Public Library. And that was super informative. And I do have a few questions for you. So we'll come up at a few minutes past our time. But we had a question that was, for how long should you be holding 529 plan in order to be able to use the money in that plan?
It's a great question. So with 529 plans, the earlier you can start it in the child's life, the better, the more time it has to have those earnings and the investments grow over that period of time. So to kind of answer your question, really, we're targeting the time when that child will be going to higher education, usually college, as the time when we're going to be taking the funds out of that plan. So the more time you have between when you start saving and putting in contributions and letting those contributions grow with investing until you actually need the money, usually around age 18, the better it has more growth there. That said, we do see some folks who use those 529 plans. You can now use it for certain high school expenses as well. So there are a couple of different avenues through which you can use those plans. And depending on how you title the account, if the first kid doesn't use it, you can often retitle and shift the title depending on how you open the account to the second kid, for example, and then use it for their college as well. So there is some shifting that can happen in case those funds aren't used for the original targeted child.
Okay, well, thank you. And I feel like, I think I grasp that there's a lot of variation in the numbers that may work for an individual, but is there a magic number?
That's a great question. And I can't tell you how many times this is the conversation I have in my office, right? Somebody's like, okay, I heard that I'm supposed to have $1 million or $2 million to retire, right? Like there's a magic number. And to your point, that's often what we can't know what that number is going to be until we look at that person's plan, because it's so customizable. So comparing yourself to others is one of the easiest ways to get stressed out. And also there's a lot of articles online that are like, oh, you should have X amount saved by X age, right? Like all of these different how-to articles. And certainly striving for that savings is really important. But we won't know if there's some magic number that means that you can retire unless we look at your particular lifestyle and your desired expenses in retirement. So my advice is, kind of cut out the noise that goes on outside of, your own personal life and really focus in on what's most important to you. I've seen people who decide to dramatically cut back their lifestyle in retirement, and they're going to need a much lower number. And I've seen people who want to, have a much more broad and diversified experience in retirement. And then, we need to save a little bit extra. So there is no magic number.
Well, that's good to know, I guess. No magic number, but pay attention to the things that are important to you, what you want for your future.
Absolutely.
And I think for people who feel behind, you had several suggestions, but I guess to kind of end on that, for people who feel behind or feel like it's too much to get started, it's overwhelming, like how could I possibly catch up? Do you have any recommendations?
Definitely book into one of our appointments this Saturday, because I think you'll feel a little bit better after you talk with one of us who can help you sort through your options. But the second thing I would say is, just start on one piece. Really just, book yourself an appointment and start with one piece. And that means even if it's just an appointment with yourself, right? You can set some time on your calendar and start with as something as simple as, I'm going to increase my retirement contributions to my retirement savings plan by 1% for my next paycheck. It can be that simple. That can be your first step. So I often I recommend for folks who are trying to deal with their finances, it can be really heavy and there's a lot of emotions tied to it.
Mhm.
So there's a term called temptation bundling. And I recommend this for a lot of my clients, where you do something hard with something that's enjoyable. And I also say, book it on the calendar. So pick a time in your week and do it even once a month. Sit with your finances and pair it with something that's really enjoyable for you afterwards. So you almost have a reward built into taking care of those numbers.
Right. That I like that. We did get one other question come in from an audience member about health savings. So health savings account, I heard we could transfer these funds into investments for retirement.
Yeah, so within a health savings account or an HSA, you can definitely invest after a certain accrual in the account. Different accounts have different minimums you have to have in the account before you can start investing it. My recommendation is that you shouldn't be planning to use the money in that account for any short-term expenses anytime in the next year and a half to 2 years. If you're going to be investing it for your future, then make sure that any money in that health savings account is really not going to be touched for a longer period of time. And yes, you absolutely can. So you just want to look inside of the account to see what investment options are available to you and what the absolute minimum amount you need to have before you can start investing.
Well, awesome. Thank you for that information.
Of course.
And so thank you again for the presentation this evening. It's been much appreciated. And so I'll just do a couple of reminders. So as you mentioned, the reminder is that we have our financial planning day on Saturday, October 16th. So this is the Pro Bono Financial Planning Day. Don't miss the opportunity to have a free private telephone consultation with a certified financial planner professional, where you can discuss your personal finance questions, concerns, and interests from the comfort of your home. You can make your appointment at www.lapl.org/financial-planning. And this concludes our presentation tonight. Don't miss tomorrow's program on Friday, October 15th at 6 p.m. Also from the Financial Planning Association, Estate Planning, Getting Your Financial House in Order. I'm looking forward to that one as well. So thank you and have a great evening. Bye.